The ontological argument explained simply. Saint Anselm of Canterbury is most famous for his ontological argument, a philosophical proof for the existence of God that relies on reason and logic alone. The argument is often considered one of the most intellectually audacious in history, as it attempts to prove the existence of God not through observation of the world, but from the very concept of God itself. To put it simply, the argument starts with a definition of God and concludes that God must exist. The core of the argument can be broken down into a few key steps. First, Anselm defines God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. This is the foundation of his entire argument. Second, he then asks us to consider this concept of God existing in our minds as an idea. The atheist, for example, can still hold the concept of God in their mind even if they don't believe God exists in reality. Third, Anselm argues that something that exists in reality is greater than something that exists only as an idea in the mind. For example, a real physical car is greater than the idea of a car. Fourth, and this is the crucial step, Anselm concludes that if God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, and if God existed only as an idea in our minds, then we could conceive of a greater being, namely, one that exists in reality. But this would be a contradiction, because our initial definition of God was that nothing greater can be conceived. Therefore, to avoid this logical contradiction, God must exist not only in our minds, but also in reality. The argument is often seen as a clever and elegant piece of logic, though it has been a subject of intense philosophical debate for centuries. Faith-seeking understanding, Anselm's philosophy. Saint Anselm's entire philosophical and theological project is encapsulated in his famous phrase, Fides quaerens intellectum, which translates to faith seeking understanding. This motto is not just a clever saying, it is the methodological and spiritual core of his work. Anselm was not a skeptic who was trying to prove the existence of God to himself. He was a man of deep and abiding faith who already believed in God. His goal as a theologian was to use the tools of reason, logic, and philosophy to gain a deeper and more profound understanding of the truths that he already accepted on faith. For Anselm, faith was the starting point, not the destination. He believed that the truths of Christian doctrine, such as the Trinity, the Incarnation, and the existence of God, were not arbitrary or irrational. They were, in fact, perfectly rational and coherent, even if their ultimate nature surpassed human comprehension. The role of the philosopher was to use reason to explore the logical structure of these truths, to show their internal consistency, and to demonstrate why they made sense. Anselm's work was a testament to the idea that faith and reason are not opposed to each other, but are complementary paths to the same divine truth. Reason could not replace faith, but it could serve to enrich it, to clarify it, and to defend it against its critics. This approach became a foundational principle for later scholastic philosophy and theology. Anselm and the problem of evil. The problem of evil, the question of how a good, all-powerful God can permit evil and suffering to exist, is one of the most enduring challenges to monotheistic belief. While Anselm did not write a separate treatise on this topic, his theological and metaphysical system provides a unique and powerful response to it. His approach is not to provide a detailed explanation for every instance of suffering, but to offer a broader metaphysical framework in which evil is understood not as a positive created reality, but as a lack of being or a privation of good. Anselm argues that God, as the supreme good, cannot be the direct cause of evil. Evil is not a thing that God created. Instead, evil is a deficiency, a corruption of something that is good. For example, blindness is not a created thing. It is the privation of sight. A lie is not a positive reality. It is the privation of truth. In this view, evil is not a substance that has being. It is a parasitic negation of being. This allows Anselm to maintain the absolute goodness and omnipotence of God without having to attribute the existence of evil to him. God creates a world that is good, but in that world there is the possibility for the privation of that good, particularly in the free will of created beings. Anselm's solution, rooted in Neoplatonic concepts, provides a powerful theological response that has been influential throughout the history of Christian thought.
Can reason prove God? Anselm's bold claim. Saint Anselm's most audacious and controversial claim was that reason alone could prove the existence of God. In his work Proslogion, he set out to find a single, irrefutable argument that was so compelling that it would convince even the fool who says in his heart, "There is no God." This was a bold departure from many of his contemporaries who believed that God's existence could only be known through faith or through a posteriori arguments that rely on observing the natural world. Anselm's argument, known as the ontological argument, bypasses all empirical observation. It is a purely a priori argument, meaning it is based entirely on logical deduction from a single, self-evident premise. By defining God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived, Anselm attempts to show that the very idea of God logically necessitates his existence. This claim was revolutionary and has been a source of fascination and debate ever since. Critics, such as the monk Ganilo and later philosophers like Immanuel Kant, have challenged the argument, but its elegance and intellectual daring have ensured its place as a cornerstone of philosophical theology. For Anselm, the answer to the question of whether reason could prove God was a resounding yes, and his attempt to do so remains one of the most famous and compelling moments in the history of ideas. Cor Deus Homo. Why did God become man? In his second major work, Cor Deus Homo, Why God Became Man, Anselm addresses one of the central mysteries of Christian theology, the Incarnation and the Atonement. His goal was not to provide a historical account, but to offer a logical, reasoned, and a priori explanation for why it was necessary for God to become man to save humanity. He begins by imagining a non-Christian who believes in God but finds the doctrine of the incarnation and crucifixion to be irrational. Anselm's explanation is based on his legal and feudal understanding of sin and satisfaction. He argues that sin is a debt owed to God, not just a moral failing. When humans sin, they take something from God's honor and order, which is of infinite value. To restore this honor, an infinite debt must be paid. Human beings, being finite, are incapable of paying an infinite debt. On the other hand, God, being infinite, is the only one who could pay the debt. But since it was humanity that sinned, it must be a human who pays it. The only solution is for a being who is both fully human and fully divine to pay this debt. This is the God-man, Jesus Christ. By his death, Christ makes a satisfaction to God that is infinitely greater than the debt of sin, thereby allowing for the forgiveness of humanity. This satisfaction theory of the atonement was a profound and systematic departure from previous theories, and it became the dominant theological explanation for the incarnation and crucifixion in Western Christianity for centuries. Saint Anselm versus the skeptics. Saint Anselm lived in a time when Christian faith was not as systematically challenged by atheism as it is today, but he was acutely aware of the fool who doubts or denies the existence of God. His entire philosophical project, particularly the ontological argument, can be seen as a direct and ambitious challenge to the skeptics. Anselm believed that the truths of faith were not irrational, and that they could be defended and clarified through the most rigorous intellectual tools available. Anselm's method was to engage with the skeptic on their own terms, using reason alone. He didn't appeal to scripture, prophecy, or miracles in his famous proof. He simply asked the skeptic to accept a single, logical definition of God, and then proceeded to show that this very definition logically entails God's existence. In his view, to deny God's existence after understanding the argument was to fall into a logical contradiction. Anselm's approach was a powerful intellectual defense of the faith, asserting that belief in God was not an act of blind faith, but was in fact the most rational position one could hold. His work inspired centuries of philosophers and theologians to follow a similar path, using reason not just to understand the world, but to understand and defend the most profound truths of religion.
The legacy of Anselm in Christian philosophy. The legacy of Saint Anselm in Christian philosophy is immense and enduring. He is widely considered one of the founders of scholasticism, the dominant philosophical tradition in medieval Europe. His famous phrase, "faith seeking understanding," became the motto and the methodological blueprint for 1,000 years of theological and philosophical inquiry. Anselm's work demonstrated that theology could be done with the same intellectual rigor and logical precision as other philosophical disciplines. His specific contributions have continued to be a source of debate and inspiration. The ontological argument has been a recurring theme in philosophical history, inspiring later thinkers like Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, and it continues to be discussed in philosophy departments today. His satisfaction theory of the atonement became the cornerstone of Western Christian soteriology,
shaping the theology of the Catholic, Protestant, and Anglican traditions. By providing a logical, reasoned, and systematic framework for understanding Christian doctrines, Anselm elevated the status of theology and laid the groundwork for the great scholastic syntheses of Thomas Aquinas and others. His writings showed that a deep faith and a powerful intellect were not mutually exclusive, but were, in fact, the two wings on which the human mind could soar towards God. God's existence, Anselm's logical proof. Anselm's argument for God's existence, as laid out in his Proslogion, is a purely logical proof that begins with the very idea of God. The argument, also known as the ontological argument, is not based on empirical evidence, but on a clever and intricate line of reasoning. Anselm starts with the definition of God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. This premise is crucial, as it is a definition that he believes even a skeptic can understand. He then proceeds to argue that this being must exist in reality. The argument is as follows. We have the concept of God in our minds, defined as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Something that exists in reality is greater than something that exists only as an idea in the mind. If God existed only as an idea, then we could conceive of a greater being, namely, one that also exists in reality.
But this would be a contradiction, as our initial definition of God was that nothing greater can be conceived. Therefore, God must exist in reality. Anselm's genius was in constructing an argument where the denial of the conclusion leads to a logical contradiction of the initial premise. This is a powerful form of argument that attempts to show that the concept of a non-existent God is inherently incoherent. The argument has been criticized, but its intellectual audacity and elegant structure have ensured that it remains one of the most famous and debated proofs for God's existence in philosophical history. Theology and logic in Anselm's writings. The writings of Saint Anselm are a perfect fusion of theology and logic. Unlike many of his predecessors who relied on tradition or mystical experience, Anselm sought to use the full power of Aristotelian logic and philosophical reasoning to explore the truths of Christian doctrine. His approach was a pioneering effort to create a systematic, rational theology. In his works, Anselm takes fundamental theological concepts such as the nature of God, the Trinity, and the Incarnation, and subjects them to rigorous logical analysis. He uses concepts like necessity, possibility, and contradiction to show the internal coherence of these doctrines. His goal was not to make God fit into the confines of human reason, but to show that God's truths were not irrational. His writing style is characterized by a clear, step-by-step logical progression, which was a significant departure from the more rhetorical and poetic style of earlier patristic literature. This methodological approach, which gave rise to the term scholasticism, transformed theology into a formal academic discipline. Anselm's work proved that a deep faith could be a catalyst for a powerful and systematic use of reason, and that the truths of religion were not immune to logical inquiry. The rational saint, Anselm's faithful reasoning. Saint Anselm is often referred to as the rational saint, because his life and work were a testament to the power of faithful reasoning. For Anselm, reason was not a tool to be used against faith, but a precious gift from God to be used in its service. He was a man of profound piety and spiritual discipline, but he believed that the most noble act of faith was not to believe blindly, but to seek to understand what one believes. This is the essence of his famous motto, Fides quaerens intellectum. It is a project of intellectual humility, where reason is used to explore the divine mysteries without ever pretending to fully comprehend them. Anselm's works, from the ontological argument for God's existence to his logical defense of the Incarnation in Cur Deus Amo, are all products of this faithful reasoning. He believed that even if we cannot fully grasp the depths of God's nature, we can still use our reason to demonstrate the logical necessity and internal coherence of the truths that have been revealed to us. This approach, which places reason at the service of faith, became a defining characteristic of medieval scholasticism and remains a powerful model for the relationship between reason and religion to this day.